What happened in the past 48 hours represents the most significant degradation of Israeli military capability since the founding of the state, and I want you to understand precisely why before the institutional messaging machine has finished constructing the alternative narrative that will be delivered to you through mainstream channels. Israel's satellite-based intelligence and communications network has been functionally destroyed, not degraded, not partially disrupted, destroyed in a manner that will take between 18 months and 3 years to reconstitute, assuming the reconstitution effort begins immediately and proceeds without further interference. In the same operational window, 400 cruise missiles struck targets across 3 countries in the most complex, coordinated, multi-axis precision strike operation that a non-NATO military force has executed in the modern era. And right now, IDF ground units operating in 3 separate theaters cannot communicate with their higher command through the encrypted satellite communication links that their operational doctrine assumes as a baseline requirement. They are using contingency communications. They are operating with degraded situational awareness, and the 400 cruise missiles that preceded their current condition were specifically designed to destroy the infrastructure on which everything they depend now rested. I have been in rooms where these decisions are made, the decisions about how to sequence a large-scale operation, about how to prioritize target sets, about how to ensure that the opening phase creates conditions that maximize the effectiveness of everything that follows. What I am describing is the product of sophisticated operational planning by people who understand the relationship between intelligence architecture and military effectiveness at a level that most Western analysts had not assigned to the Iranian Strategic Command. That assessment was wrong. I need you to understand how wrong it was and what that means. Let me start with the satellite dimension because it is the least understood element and the most consequential. Israel operates a constellation of reconnaissance and communication satellites that form the backbone of its military information architecture. The OFEC series of reconnaissance satellites, at least 6 operationally active as of recent assessments, provide signals intelligence and imagery collection that feeds directly into the IDF's targeting cycles. The AMOS series of communication satellites provide encrypted military communication links for ground, air, and naval forces. These satellites orbit in low Earth and medium Earth orbit trajectories with well-characterized parameters that have been public knowledge for years through standard orbital mechanics databases that any state with a space program can access. The orbital parameters are not secret. The communication frequencies used by the military payloads are not fully secret. The ground station infrastructure that uplinks to the satellites is not secret. It consists of fixed installations that can be mapped by commercial satellite imagery. Stay with me because the method by which satellites can be killed without kinetic anti-satellite weapons and without creating the debris fields that kinetic OSAT weapons produced is the technical capability that makes this development so strategically significant. The primary method assessed for the satellite network disruption is high-power radio frequency jamming combined with directed energy blinding of optical reconnaissance payloads, a combination attack that does not destroy the satellite physically but renders it operationally useless. High-power RF jamming of satellite uplink frequencies, when conducted at sufficient power levels from ground stations positioned within the satellite's field of view, prevents the satellite from receiving commands and transmitting data to authorized ground stations. The satellite continues to orbit, it continues to function at the hardware level, but its relationship to its operators is severed. The ground stations that need the satellite's intelligence product receive nothing, or receive noise that cannot be processed into usable intelligence. The military units that need satellite communication receive no signal or receive a degraded signal insufficient for the encrypted communication protocols their systems require. The directed energy blinding capability, high-powered lasers directed at the optical sensors of reconnaissance satellites during their overhead passes, produces sensor damage or temporary dazzling that degrades imagery quality to the point of operational uselessness. Israel's OFEC reconnaissance satellites carry electro-optical sensors designed to provide sub-meter resolution imagery for target identification. A laser ground system capable of achieving sufficient power density at the satellite's altitude, which for low Earth orbit reconnaissance satellites is typically between 400 and 700 kilometers, can produce sensor damage that cannot be repaired on orbit. The satellite continues to orbit. The sensor no longer functions. The imagery the military commanders need does not come. Iran has been developing directed energy ground systems and high-power RF jamming capability for a period longer than Western assessments were crediting. The operational deployment of these systems, not against Israeli satellites specifically, which would have been identified as a hostile act requiring immediate response, c, but against the ground communication infrastructure that interfaces with the satellite network, was the entry point. Once the ground station link is disrupted, the satellite's communication payload is isolated and can be selectively jammed or blinded during subsequent passes. What the mainstream media will not tell you is that the 400 cruise missiles that struck across 3 countries were not the opening move of this operation. They were the exploitation phase. The opening move was the degradation of the intelligence and communication architecture that would have provided early warning, targeting data for defensive fire, and real-time communication between the attacked parties and their command authorities. The 400 missiles arrived into a target environment where the defenders had degraded situational awareness of the threat's composition, approach vectors, and prioritization. The missile strikes were more effective because of the prior intelligence suppression than they would have been against a fully connected defense. Sequencing matters in multi-phase operations. Iran sequenced this correctly. Let me tell you what the 400 cruise missiles actually struck, because the targeting list that is emerging from reporting and visual confirmation tells you something precise about Iranian strategic priorities. The documented target categories include radar installations providing early warning coverage of the approaches from which Iranian ballistic missile forces would launch in a subsequent phase, air defense battery control systems, and search radar installations at 10 identified surface-to-air missile sites across the theater, logistic staging areas associated with forward IDF ground force postures, and communication relay infrastructure, including over-the-horizon radar systems that provide extended maritime and airspace awareness. The targeting list is a preparation of the battlefield operation. It is the systematic destruction of the architecture that would allow effective defense against subsequent operations. This was not an end in itself. This was phase one of a multi-phase campaign, and the 400 missiles that struck these targets were preparing the environment for whatever comes next. Keep watching because the cascade of consequences from what I have just described reaches into every dimension of the strategic competition in this theater. IDF ground forces operating with degraded satellite communication are operating with contingency communication systems, high-frequency radio, tactical satellite terminals operating on commercial or reserve frequencies, and in some cases, no communication beyond line-of-sight tactical radio. HF radio in a dense electronic warfare environment, and the IRGC has been conducting intensive EW operations in the theater, is susceptible to direction finding and jamming. Tactical satellite terminals operating on commercial frequencies are not encrypted to the same standard as military satellite links. The intelligence product that the OFEC constellation would normally provide to ground commanders, real-time imagery of Iranian force dispositions, targeting data for precision strikes, battle damage assessment for completed fire missions, is degraded or absent. Ground commanders are fighting with less information, communicating through less secure channels, and making decisions with greater uncertainty about adversary positions and intentions than their operational doctrine assumes. This is not a temporary inconvenience. It is a fundamental change in the operating conditions of IDF ground forces that affects how they can be employed, what risks can be accepted, and how quickly command authority can be transmitted through the force. Operations that depend on real-time intelligence product and encrypted satellite command communication are not executable at their designed tempo when those dependencies are degraded. The operational tempo of IDF ground operations will slow. The risk of friendly fire incidents increases when situational awareness degrades. The risk of command and control failures increases when communication architecture is compromised. These are not hypothetical risks. They are the documented operational consequences of the communication and intelligence degradation that has just occurred. Before we go any further, I need you to understand the great power dimension of what has just happened, because this is where the civilizational stakes become explicit. The United States provides a range of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance support to Israeli military operations through information sharing arrangements that allow American collection assets to contribute to Israeli targeting cycles. If Iranian operations have degraded the Israeli nodes of this information sharing architecture, the United States now faces a decision about how to compensate, either by increasing its own direct presence in ways that make American assets more directly exposed to the same vulnerabilities, or by accepting that the shared intelligence architecture that underpins American-Israeli military cooperation in the theater is temporarily degraded in ways that the adversary can exploit. The decisions being made right now, as we speak, in the intelligence community and in the NSC concern exactly this problem. And they are being made in a 48-hour operational window where every hour that passes without reconstituting the degraded architecture is an hour that Iranian forces can exploit the information advantage they have created. What happens in the coming days will determine whether the Iranian operational gamble that degrading the intelligence and communication architecture would create decision-making paralysis in the adversary before sufficient response capacity could be reconstituted was accurately calibrated. If it was, the next phase of Iranian operations begins in conditions maximally favorable to the attacker and maximally unfavorable to the defender. If it was not, the defender finds ways to reconstitute faster than the attacker projected, and the operational advantage is shorter lived than intended. Right now, the outcome of that race is not determined. What I can tell you is that the race is real, the stakes are enormous, and anyone who tells you the situation is under control does not understand what being deaf and blind actually means for a military force that has built its operational doctrine around seeing everything and knowing everything before it acts.